Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Richard Lummis for a new season. And today we're going to start with the presidency and life of Warren G. Harding. Richard, I have to say, I was surprised about some of the things I discovered in researching for this podcast. Warren G. Harding is typically thought of as the worst U.S. president ever. It's a little more nuanced than that. He had a really interesting pre-political career that in many ways shaped, I think, his political career in ways that we haven't seen before. And as once again we have discovered, there's absolutely nothing new in American politics. So you want to introduce us with a little overview of Warren Harding?
Yeah, he was born in 1865 and spent his life in rural Ohio when he was not out of it for political reasons. But in many ways, he's just a transitional figure between the politics of the 19th and the 20th century and the technologies of the 19th and the 20th century. As you mentioned, my conception of him was somewhat limited and I think a bit unfair to him. But we'll get into that and the nuance of what his career actually was like. Why don't you tell us a bit about his early life and career before politics?
Sure. So he had a very interesting early life and career. One of the things that we hear lots of rumors and stories about his life and death, and one that dogged him forever was that he was a descendant of an African American. This was never proven, but as always, race plays a big part in American politics and American life. And he was accused of having, I think it was a great grandfather or maybe even a great grandfather. And that turned out to be incorrect. But the thing that really struck me about his early life was that he was a newspaper editor. He had fallen in love with the newspapers, perhaps a prototype Charles Foster Kane. But he bought a newspaper called the Marion Star, which was in the hometown he lived in, Marion, Ohio. And he bought it when he was 18. And this was very unusual for someone of his age to buy it. And I thought, journalist, newspaper man, bought a paper, big success, and that started his political career. The last part may have been true, but it wasn't a big success. He actually lost it in receivership at one point, and he had to buy it out of receivership. So he had certainly some financial struggles around that. The second part of this I want to bring in now was his marriage to a woman named Florence Kling. And she was a prototype political wife. And she pushed him in business. She pushed him in politics. She pushed him in the presidency. And she was a driving force behind him. We've both heard apocryphal stories about he was not exactly a lovable loser, but certainly lovable, and tried to never take a position, never say anything ugly, never degenerate or denigrate someone in print or when he was a politician. Perhaps that's not new in American politics, though. Nevertheless, she became a part of the newspaper business, eventually becoming the COO or chief operating officer, but she ran the books and records part of it. So she was a big part of that. She pushed him into politics. And the thing I wanted to pick up on and maybe explore a little bit was how his work as a journalist may have informed him as a politician. Because as a journalist, he strove to be incredibly even-handed. And in his political career, I'm not sure it moved to him being even-handed, but it moved him in a way that he would give a position and people would walk away thinking that was their position. He had taken their position. And then the next group would come in and it would be the opposite. So he either developed that skill or had that skill of basically saying what everybody wanted to hear. And it seems like to me he learned that as a newspaper editor. And that really led him to the starting of his political career. You want to talk us through that?
Yeah, as you mentioned, his even-handedness turned out to be a real asset in politics because he's popular with politicians of both parties because he never published critical stories about any of them if he could avoid it. And he started not quite at the bottom, But in 1899, he won the first of two terms to Ohio State Senate. Uh, Apparently, traditionally at the time, you only served a term, but in his second term, he was elected majority leader. He stepped up to become lieutenant governor in 1903, but returned to run the newspaper in 1905. He then ran for governor of Ohio in 1910, but lost. Due to his popularity with party insiders, he was given the honor of placing Taft's name in the nomination at the Republican convention of 1912. But he was shouted down by the pro-Theodore Roosevelt delegates and was terribly offended by the loud, rude behavior that he'd been subjected to. 1914, he won the Republican primary for U.S. Senator and beat Attorney General Timothy Hogan in the general election, which was the first popular election of senators following adoption of the 17th Amendment. The main issue in the election turned out to be Hogan's Catholicism, although Harding personally never mentioned that all of his surrogates were quite vicious in beating the drum about the handing America over to the Pope and so forth. His career in the U.S. Senate is generally fairly undistinguished. He made few enemies and a lot of friends. He missed a lot of sessions, including the ones dealing with the most contentious issues, possibly to avoid having to take a position on them. And so he served as keynote speaker and chairman of the 1916 Republican Convention. We'll get back to his position on international relations subsequently, but he did stand solidly with Henry Cabot Lodge in opposing the League of Nations. Early on, he had voted in favor of the resolution of war in 1917. He voted for most war legislation, including the Espionage Act, and supporting expanding presidential powers during the war. But by May of 1918, he'd switched sides and voted against a bill to expand Wilson's powers further. He did oppose an excess profits taxes as anti-business. Republicans took control of the Senate in 1918 midterms, and Harding was appointed to the Foreign Relations Committee, where he made a major speech opposing both the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. He's mainly pro-business and therefore anti-progressive, you would think, but one of the things that benefited him was Theodore Roosevelt's untimely death in 1919, which brought most progressives back into the Republican fold. And that kind of leads us up to the 1920 Republican Convention.
Sure. There's a couple of things I'd like to pick up on from this phase of his career and maybe even a little bit earlier. From 1889 to 1901, he was hospitalized or put into a sanatorium 5 times for various illnesses, overstrain, fatigue, etc. And this, I think, is a clear presaging of the physical difficulties he was going to have as president in the medical realm. He eventually died of what we now think was a heart attack, although perhaps that's open to debate as well. Nevertheless, he did not have a healthy constitution. His lifestyle as an older gentleman didn't help that constitution, but he clearly has something wrong with the physical makeup of his body, and that leads to his untimely demise. The second thing is, and you touched on, is this was the first publicly elected or popularly elected U.S. senator. The Constitution was changed in 1913. In 1914, we started having votes. Prior to that time, the state legislature determined who would be the candidates or the senators from a particular state. So I think he was clearly a beneficiary. I think he was very popular. I think we see that, I think it was the 14th Amendment? 17th Amendment in action, having a direct election of senators by populaces of state. If we hadn't had that, he might not have become senator, and he might not have become president. But that leads to one of the great political events and years in America's history. You called it a transformation, and I think this 1920 was probably a linchpin of a lot of different transformations. But the convention opened with Harding clearly not the favorite to become the GOP nominee for the president. I think he was 3 or 4 on the top list of candidates. But he knew that, and his campaign to become the nominee was planned on being someone who could unite the party if the top two candidates failed. One thing you didn't mention was, and I was a little surprised to read this, he was a firm supporter of women's suffrage, and that was hugely popular in Ohio. It was, I think, a popular position he took in the Senate, and that, I think, actually helped him, although the convention delegates were largely male. If you could be physically conservative and socially liberal in the 1920s, I think women's suffrage was at the top of those issues. So he was there, and through, I think it was 10 votes where the convention could not reach a majority, he was there. And he became the nominee after one of the great legendary nights of American political history, the smoke-filled room. And I think, Richard, you earlier said we've had smoke-filled rooms since at least smoke. Whether we have to go back to pre-colonial Virginia or maybe even Aristotle on that point, I'm not quite sure. But the smoke-filled room was allegedly came out of this convention. Once again, I'm not sure about that. But what we had was the way politics was done from, I think, at least the Civil War up until this convention, which was largely a group of party elders would get together and decide. Those elders could be senators, they could be other politicians, they could be justices of a Supreme Court. There could also be party apparatchiks, and there could be party operatives. Mark Hanna had come from Ohio. He had died in the first decade of the 20th century, but I think in many ways his system of patronage was still in play in Ohio. The patronage system was in full force, and Warren G. Harding came out of the smoke-filled room as the nominee who could unite the party going forward. This was, I think, the last time this happened in American politics. But remember, Harry Truman came out of this tradition. So we can't say we got bad presidents because of a smoke-filled room or a patronage system, because I think Harry Truman, his time, was a good president. Nevertheless, the legend is a smoke-filled room, and that leads to perhaps a legendary campaign. And part of that legend was he ran what's called a front porch campaign, meaning he sat on his front porch in Marion, Ohio, and didn't travel. He let his underlings and Republican operatives go out and give speeches and attack the Democrats, who were even in more disarray in 1920. We were coming off, obviously, World War I, lots of issues around that. The war boom was tapering out, and we were moving into a recession of 1920 and 1921. And many people wanted to go back to pre-World War I. And Harding gave a speech that kind of became the catchword or buzz phrase of the election, which was return to normalcy. And it was a little broader than that, but that's what it was called, and that's what everyone remembered. And Richard, you and I we're recording this in December of 2024. Obviously, we had a year of 2020 of the pandemic year, COVID-19, and many people are calling for a return to pre-COVID. And I guess the thing I would ask our listeners to consider is, can you ever go back in American history? Can you ever go back in American politics? You can change, you can have adaptation, you can respond to events on the ground, but I don't think you can have a return to normalcy if normalcy is measured as something that was 6 years ago, or in our case now 5 years ago. Maybe it was a pipe dream, maybe it was a good catchphrase, but it certainly caught the imagination of the public as well. And on one last point, it certainly leads to another set of events and another set of podcasts on this series, which was his selection of Calvin Coolidge as a running mate. We used to say you needed to balance the party ticket geographically. Calvin Coolidge, New England. Here we had an Ohioan. Calvin Coolidge, allegedly taciturn, allegedly quiet, but actually a little bit sharper mind than certainly I may have given him credit for in our research for that series of podcasts. So I think his running mate selection added some significance and gravitas to his ticket, and that led to just a stunning election victory that we'll talk about in a little bit. As we get to the election, maybe could I ask you for your reflections or what you see or may have surprised you of Warren G. Harding at this point or up to this point?
A couple of things. One is, as you pointed out, he came out of the Mark Hanna school of patronage, um, basically trading favors and influence, which, of course, goes back at least as far as ancient Rome. But by the end of the 20th century, by the end of the 19th century, sorry, it had fallen out of favor and became known as graft and corruption. We'll see that tension continue throughout Harding's brief presidency, but I do think that was important. He also became one of the first sort of modern figures in terms of the use of technology with newsreels, photographs. He hired Albert Lasker, one of the key figures in early advertising from Chicago, to help run his campaign. And he also introduced telemarketers with scripts. So if you're looking for a reason to hate Harding, there you go. He was not the candidate of the elites. He was extraordinarily popular personally. He seems to have been a genuinely nice human being, a species now extinct in American politics, apparently. But the New York Times called him a very respectable Ohio politician of the second class. New York World said he was the least qualified candidate since James Buchanan, Tom's favorite president. But in any event, I think the persona he projected, or at least that Lasker projected for him, was exactly what America wanted to hear, which was the return to normalcy. It's hearkening back to an idyllic rural lifestyle that he came from, and I think that showed in the election results.
That brings us up to the election of 2020, in many ways transformational. In many ways, I think the people spoke. You want to tell us about what happened?
Yeah. It was an absolute landslide. Harding took 60.2% of the popular vote and 404 out of 531 electoral votes. Contrast between, I think that may have been the largest percentage of the popular vote since the advent of the two-party system.
Correct.
Of course, Washington beat it, but in any event, it shows the incredible popularity of the platform and the personality as projected, which, of course, given his ultimate historical reputation, is quite ironic. Why don't you tell us a bit about his domestic policies during his presidency, Tom?
Richard, and I will start off by saying this was perhaps the most surprising part of the re-understanding or reinterpretation I needed to make around Warren G. Harding. He would set general guidelines and then let his underlings effectuate the policy. And he did that with his cabinet secretaries. He did that with Congress. And he did that with all of those who had to implement policies. And he had two, what I think would be contra ideas, but they worked. The first one was, and Richard, I hope I don't shock you with, there were tariff issues in the 1920s. Now, we're only 100 years later, and I'm not quite sure where Donald Trump may have come up with his tariff ideas, but perhaps he was inspired by Warren G. Harding, because Harding's idea was to increase tariffs to protect American farmers. Gee, where have I heard that before? And it worked, at least for a little bit. But the other part was the income tax became constitutional in 1913. 1914 was the first year. There were very low tax rates. I think 1 to 2 and maybe a 3% tax rate. Those went up to 10% shock during the war to fund World War I. And so there was a movement to reduce tax rates, not simply to reduce citizens' burdens to pay taxes to the U.S. government, but it was thought that the Treasury Department would actually increase their revenue with a decrease in taxes. Now, that seems to me to be completely contradictory, but it worked. And tax revenues increased. They were able to move to not only paying off the deficit that had been established during World War I, but it led to a series of years where there was a budget surplus. So we had tariff increases helping the economy, and we had a tax decrease, not simply pumping more money into the economy, but it also increased revenues to the federal government. So this, I think in many ways, fueled the fire that became the Roaring Twenties, but it was a set of policies that had never been implemented together before because we had never been in a situation where the deficit was so high and taxes were so high because of this point where we were in time. Also, we had the women's suffrage movement of what Harding had supported. Obviously, 1919 was a constitutional amendment, but it had to be passed by the states. So we were still in that era. And there was also a creation of a Veterans Bureau that ended up being run by a gentleman named Charles Forbes. And he was part of the scandal-laden administration of Harding that we'll get to later. So that was important as well. I really did have to reassess the Harding presidency based upon this information, albeit it was a short presidency from the spring of 2021 until his death in 2023. Nevertheless, some positive policies. We need to emphasize really as much as we can, and you started with this, his personal popularity. He was a hugely popular president when he was still alive. And once again, this was contradictory to what I had understood sort of growing up, that he was this idiot that wasn't up to the presidency who made lots of bad mistakes. Maybe all that was true, but he was hugely popular at the time. You want to tell us a little bit about some of his foreign affairs dealings?
Sure, but first I think we have to address another of the real peculiarities of his administration, which is the composition of his cabinet. It consisted of some real all-time all-stars, such as Andrew Mellon at the Treasury and Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce, who turned out to be extremely influential, but also Charles Evan Hughes as Secretary of State. The Hardings sort of has a reputation as an isolationist, which I'm not sure is entirely fair. It is true that he made speeches against the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, but again, whether that was out of any sort of principle or whether he was just being a good Republican soldier, I don't know. But once he was in office, Hughes and I expect Mellon had a great deal to do with it, implemented the Dawes Plan, which reduced German reparations, and then the reparations that Germany did pay were funded by American loans to Germany. So it fueled an economic boom in Germany, which helped stimulate international trade, including with the U.S. Some economists trace this as sort of a house of cards thing that later contributed to the collapse of the economy in Germany and the worldwide Great Depression. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but it is an argument you'll hear. Another of his internationalist moves was the Washington Armament Conference, which was basically a naval disarmament conference, where the great powers agreed that England and the United States would have rough parity in capital ships, which at the time meant battleships, and Japan would be limited to 60% of that number, which is more equitable than it sounds, given that Japan only had interests in the Western Pacific, while both England and the U.S. were two-ocean navies. But it was one of the few disarmament conferences that seemed to hold throughout its term. When he took office, we had troops all over Latin America, thank you, Woodrow, and Harding withdrew the troops from Cuba, but he did leave the troops in place in Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua. He negotiated recognition with Mexico. We had not recognized a government in Mexico, I think, since Diaz. But eventually, we recognized the Obregón government. That didn't happen until about a month after his death, but it was certainly one of his impetus. I don't think we can really discuss Harding, of course, without these scandals that have dogged his reputation ever since. You know.
Sure. So before we get to his scandals, I want to say a couple of words about his death. He's reported to have suddenly died in July of 2023. I don't think there was really anything sudden about it. He had a very bad bout of influenza in January of 2023, which I'm not sure he ever recovered from. Also, the first half of the year, he did two things which may have shown he knew he was on his last leg. He wrote out a new will and he sold the Marion Star. Parenthetically, Richard, I would note that we had a president who owned an ongoing business concern. Perhaps that's not new in American politics either. Nevertheless, he committed to, in the spring of 2023, a tour of the West, all the way across the country to Alaska. And he went to Alaska. He became the first sitting U.S. president to visit Canada, visiting Vancouver and Vancouver Island. On his way back to the United States, he gave multiple speeches, and he ended up dying from what we believe now was a heart attack in July of 2023. There may have been inklings of scandals in his administration before his demise, but after he died, they really came to the fore. And there were three major ones I'd like to highlight, Richard. The one that everyone probably listening to this podcast is aware of is Teapot Dome. Up until Watergate, certainly the worst scandal in American political history. But there were also two others. There was one in the Department of Justice, which involved the sale of justice and enforcement by the DOJ. And then one that personally offended me that I was not aware of was a scandal in the Veterans Administration. This was before the VA got their own department. So it was an administration, I think, in health, education, and welfare, or whatever it was called at that time. Nevertheless, the government committed to building a series of hospitals across the United States to care for veterans from World War I. And a series of construction companies paid bribes to the administrator of the Veterans Administration, Charles Forbes, who I mentioned before. And this exponentially increased the price. And I've seen some numbers that said the price of a bed went up between $4,000 to $10,000 per bed. And these were hundreds of hospitals with hundreds of beds. And that's how they generated the money to pay for the bribes. They stole it from the American people through increased in cost. So that led to many of these hospitals not being built because simply the funding ran out. And I think this was the scandal that offended me the most. As I said, the most famous one is Teapot Dome, and there the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, the U.S. government held leases, or the Department of Navy held leases for energy reserves on three separate lots. And Fall was bribed to direct the contracts to certain companies. And this was a huge scandal at the time. It remains a huge scandal today, but it's emblematic of the administration of Warren G. Harding. There has, I don't believe, been any substantive evidence that he was involved or even knew about these scandals or knew any of the details, but he was the captain of the ship. He was the president. It happened under his watch. It happened because of people he appointed. The Harry Doherty at the Department of Justice and Charles Forbes both came from the Ohio Gang, which was the group of Ohio hangers-oners who hung on during his administration, part of the patronage system we talked about a little earlier. So this really led to a major change in the way people thought about Harding. It also turned out that he was having an affair and had child or children out of wedlock during this time. And all of these really led to he lost the goodwill of the American people, and his administration became synonymous with cronyism and corruption.
Yeah, that's all true and unfortunate, but I think part of it has to be viewed as being part of the transitional figure that I regard him as between the patronage era of graft and corruption and the meritocratic era of Mellon, Hoover, Hughes, and so forth. But as you pointed out, these scandals were real scandals, and they were corruption. and that they did show the abuse that was possible from the patronage system. I'd originally thought that Harding probably got a raw deal on the cronyism thing because, as you pointed out, he probably did not personally even know about it and certainly didn't personally profit from him, and thought that maybe his presidency was a lost opportunity, sort of like Garfield, that it could have been a good to great presidency instead of mediocre. But I think his personal inability to say no and his lack of any really strong principles about much of anything. I mean, we referred to his even-handedness before as a virtue, but in some instances, I think it's a vice. And I think that it overshadowed some of his administration.
Some of the quotes that came out of this reassessment I thought were really interesting, Richard. Out of the incredible era, The Life and Times of Warren G. Harding, the author wrote, "An amiable, well-meaning third-rate Babbitt with the equipment of a small-town, semi-educated journalist. It could not work. It did not work." Another, "a remarkably unbalanced and unfair accounts, exaggerating the negative, assigning responsibility to Harding for all wrongs and denying him credit for doing anything right." So that really, I think, sums up maybe the two viewpoints. But for me, I think it's a much more nuanced view of Harding, and I think a reassessment is probably in order. But that reassessment, I think, should encompass a point you raised, which this may have been a missed opportunity. And I don't think we would ever call the 20s in America the lost years. We may have had a lost generation, but we had the Roaring Twenties. We had a lot of innovation. But I think that you're right. We may have been able to go in a little bit different direction, particularly around these economic issues that worked and the embrace by Andrew Mellon of John Maynard Keynes saying we can't tax Germany to death for 100 years for losing a war because it will put the whole world in a Great Depression. Now, we did have that Great Depression, but I think those views pretty progressive for international views, particularly from America, and we may have gone in a different direction. So perhaps a reassessment of that lost opportunity would be in order.
I think that's partly underway, but the other thing we have him to thank for was the vice presidency of Calvin Coolidge, which I guess we'll get into in our next episode.